Okay, let's open in a word of prayer here. Father, thank you so much for a beautiful day. Pray that you will guide us as we talk about things related to Bible prophecy and the things that are coming on the world and that are already here. Pray that you will bless us today. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, today we're going to talk about when the unthinkable becomes reality. As I listen to a lot of different shows and people talking and that sort of thing, I pick up on little catchphrases that I hear, sort of common themes that I hear. And one of the themes that I heard this week a number of times people saying was, this was unthinkable 3 months ago, 4 months ago, 6 months ago. Early in the year, I sort of made a little joke title one week. I said the year 2020 in review. That was in January because it seemed like a lot of different things were going on at the time and it was just craziness. And that was before the COVID thing hit and the economy and now what we have. And so now I would say is I'm done with 2020. I've had enough. But I do like 2020 because it gives me the ability to do these cute little different, like this week is spectacles or the zeros in 2020. It gives me this opportunity, but it really is. And I sort of pulled out this old foreign policy cover that I've used for many, many years now, World Disrupted. And that was in the peaceful days of 7 or 8 years ago when they used that title. And it's almost like, what title could they use now? Because what are the words that we would use to describe this? And it is a time when the events that will unfold in the end times are in preparation, getting very much closer, I think, and they are converging. And I think that this convergence will be something that we will continue to see until the Lord returns and sets up his kingdom. I just don't think that any of this is going away. I think sometimes humor helps relieve the tension a little bit. Someone sent me this. It said, this is what happens when you set the flux capacitor in your DeLorean to 2020. Kind of accurate, really. Very clever. I'm not sure what happened to that DeLorean, but somebody suggested that this guy is already in running for the Time Person of the Year, the mayhem guy from the insurance commercials. And that's pretty true. All kidding aside, though, I have gotten a number of emails this week, messages and emails from people who are very distressed. Some, I've heard this from a number of people, I don't know if I can go on any longer. I'm a Christian. I believed in Bible prophecy. And frankly, I had been taught that I would be out of here and never have to see any of the things that I'm currently seeing unfold. And that's an unfortunate thing, is that many people have been given that impression. Because in America, we've been kind of protected from, we have been protected from a large portion of the persecution that the church has undergone around the world. In the reports this week, I don't even have slides on it because I don't have time to get everything ready and edit it down to keep it to a reasonable length of time. Someone suggested some Sunday we'll just do a 4 or 5 hour update. Like that'll be enough time. Because I don't know that even then that's enough time to cover some of the things that are going on, if we want to look at them in a little bit of depth. But the things I find out or hear about persecution are just incredible. In Nigeria, 81 Christians slaughtered, hacked to death the other day. Iran is trying to get rid of Christian communities, some of the oldest Christian communities in the world where they still speak Aramaic. China is closing churches. It seems everywhere you look that there's something going on like this about Christian persecution. And I will be honest with you, I don't have the words to say to comfort you necessarily when these incredible times of stress and distress come. I can only point people to the Word of God. And Joshua, in Joshua chapter 1, there's some great verses, but one is Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded thee? Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee wherever thou goest. Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be dismayed. Why? Because the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest. Another verse that I took some comfort in this week, and I think that you'll be able to see the application of it when I get to part of my talk. Watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit you like men, be strong. Or as the NASB says, be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, act like men. Be strong. And I'm not seeing a lot of that among a large portion of the church today, particularly with the response to the protests and that type of thing going on. I keep, and I know Pastor Steve feels this way too, where are the men that are going to stand up and speak the truth to this? Now there are, okay, but I'm telling you that what I've seen is shocking. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus said that, talking to his disciples, but by extension us, that it's going to get bad. And when they bring you unto the synagogues and unto magistrates and powers, take ye no thought, or what thing ye shall answer, or what ye shall say, for the Holy Ghost shall teach you in the same hour what ye ought to say. And the question is, do we really believe that? And it's not easy to believe that that will happen. I keep thinking of those guys in the orange jumpsuits on the beach in Libya before they're executed. And what was the last thing coming off their lips? Every one of them. Jesus. Jesus. Now, I've seen people say, well, you know, they might have been Coptic Christians and they might have had some errors in their Listen, I don't care about all that. What were they trusting in at that particular moment? That's what counts. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus also talks about this. Then they shall deliver you up to be afflicted and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended and shall betray one another and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many, and because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. Now, is any of this happening today? Really? A little bit? Yeah. A little bit. If you mean by a little bit, you mean like a whole bunch. Yeah, that's right. A little bit. But look at what the persecution comes because of in verse 9. For my name's sake. For the sake of the name of Jesus. 1 Peter chapter 4 talks about persecution. Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you, but rejoice, inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory shall be revealed, ye may also be glad with exceeding joy. If ye are reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye. For the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. On their part he is evil spoken of, but on your part he is glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. For the time is come that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first begin at us, what shall the end be of them that obey not the gospel of God? And if the righteous scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and the sinner appear? Wherefore, let them that suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to him in well-doing, as unto a faithful Creator. So today I want to just look at some of the things that are going on. Let's first look at in terms of a disrupted world and the unthinkable. First, I would turn to the economy. Headline from Gulf News: World to suffer worst recession in 80 years. Global economy seeing shrinking 5.2%. Headline, front page in The Guardian yesterday, about the UK heading for the worst recession in more than 300 years. April output down 20%. With the caveat, May's going to be worse. These numbers are continually bandied about as unprecedented. Wall Street was up a little bit this week. It actually went back up to where it was back in January. I don't believe that recovery is necessarily real. It's papered over with the Fed pumping all kinds of money into the market. And the market has gone up almost exactly in terms of dollar value, almost exactly what the Fed has pumped into it. That doesn't seem like a real recovery to me. And how long can they string that out? How long do they want to string that out? Is there some other bigger agenda behind it? I will close with some things about that. But this is the report that came out from the World Bank Group, the Global Economic Prospects, and they talked about different things. They looked at, like, for example, the United States, industrial production and retail sales are way down. Oil prices and oil structure investment are way down. TSA passenger traffic is way, way down. Look at that traveler in the upper right-hand corner. TSA passenger traffic, travelers per day in the millions. We're way down below 1 million, and it used to be pushing close to 3 million, 2.5 million per day. Now down below like 100,000. And the question becomes, do you really want to travel anymore? I was just reading about Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and if you want to travel there, you're free to come, but when you get there, you have to spend 14 days in quarantine. Okay, so I have a 15-day vacation. I think I might just stay home. And this is the problem. This is, I don't know when this resolves. Maybe it's the time to say, I hope you're happy where you are, because you may not be going anywhere soon. Reduction in hours worked. If you look at the economy in the Euro area, the numbers are equally bad. Not quite as bad. Part of that is because they have a little more government involvement in their economy, so they've been able to protect things, but they're just pumping money in too, like the Federal Reserve is. Look at in the lower left-hand corner, share of tourism in GDP in 2019. Some countries like Portugal and Spain, 15 to 20% of their economy was based on tourism. So when you look at the air travel numbers being so far down, 95%, how do you think their economy is going to do? At least 95% of their economy is gone. I saw a big article this morning about tour operators in places that used to be so crowded. People were trying to think, it would be nice if we could just reduce the crowds here in Venice because it's just too many people. Okay, you got your wish. Now there's no people and nobody to use a tour operator, and they're going out of business. They're just crazy. Look at here, global trade, the first figure A, container shipping and new export orders. You see the red line? That looks like it's down quite a bit, 38%. Global manufacturing and services. See the red line that drops there? These are things that nobody has ever seen before. When they look at some of the charts, here's again the container, here's the trade growth, everything is down. They're predicting that it might go up a little bit in 2021. That may be fantasy. Here's a chart that talks about growth of GDP and per capita GDP in global recessions, looking at from 1975 to 2020. And you can see back in 2009 recession, world GDP went down 1.8%. Now it's down 5.2%. The interesting thing, though, that is in advanced economies, GDP is down even more than it is in emerging economies. And these numbers are a couple months old. They'll be much worse. Here's a chart that shows decline in the economy, economic contraction. Dark blue is not good throughout the Eurozone. And here is what an accompanying article, this is from Geopolitical Futures. The important takeaway here is that these figures reflect just 1 month of lockdown in Europe. Second quarter figures will likely be much worse. It's also important to note what these numbers won't be able to tell us. That is whether the damage is permanent and how quickly it can be undone. The general line of thinking is that the longer social restrictions are in place, the higher the risk for permanent damage, making the performance in the second quarter all the more important. From the Financial Times, they noted an interesting thing happening. Retail stock market investors pile bets on bankrupt U.S. companies. Hertz and JCPenney filed for bankruptcy protection because they're bankrupt. They're going out of business. They can't pay their debts. So what's happened? Their stock value from the time before they filed bankruptcy has, in the case of Hertz, gone up 800%. And in the case of JCPenney, it's gone up 452%. Why? That doesn't make any sense. And it's almost all retail small investors that are doing this. Well, the answer may be in another article in the Financial Times. Collapsing rates leave investors perilously exposed to equity risk because the central banks have cut interest rates to next to nothing. So you can't, I don't know what the interest rate I wouldn't even bother to check the interest rate on a CD right now, certificate of deposit. And so because people, they want to return, so they're taking incredible risk, investing in bankrupt companies. And it's become quite a bit of a phenomenon that I've seen, and I don't know that it ends well. Federal Reserve Chairman Powell came out this week and said, we're going to keep interest rates where they are through probably 2022, which means virtually zero. In the process of selling and buying a house, I'm familiar with interest rates, and I'm seeing long-term mortgage interest rates below 3%. I remember when we got our first house, through an FHA program, and when we first started looking when I was in law school, remember the Carter days when the interest rates were like 18%? Now, you could make a lot of money on a CD back in those days, and compound interest is a bit of a miracle, but these things are unprecedented. And what Powell said in his speech, and I don't really have time to go into it, is that, I'll summarize it, things are dire. Now, I've been accused of And probably rightly so. Your updates are a bummer. They're very negative and dark. Okay. You know, I call balls and strikes. Sometimes I feel like the great baseball announcer Vin Scully, who did his best work when he was silent. He seemed to have this ability to be silent at the right time. Like, remember when Kirk Gibson hit that home run in the '88 World Series, and he didn't say anything for like 3 minutes. And he was paid to say something. And everybody thought, what a great announcer he is, because he didn't say anything. But look, I watch a lot of other people who do prophecy updates, just sort of a check to make sure I'm not hanging out there too far. And I hear all of them say, hey, the United States is not in Bible prophecy. Okay, well, isn't that a little bit dark? The United States is going away. We don't know when. So I will repeat the question that I ask people occasionally. What did you really think the end times were going to look like or be like? Did you think that maybe they just might be like they are now or worse? It's an incredible thing. Oil price, they've kind of got a little bit of, they think the Saudis came out and said, oh, we're going to do great on oil because everybody's agreed to cuts. So oil prices have gone up a little bit, stabilized, and guess what happens? Companies, shale oil companies in the United States start drilling again. That puts more oil into the system, which causes oversupply, and this thing is going to take a while to resolve. It just does. I just don't know how it's going to work. Here's an article from the Wall Street Journal the other day. Oil falters as Libya and U.S. mute cuts made by OPEC. So OPEC's like, oh, we got everything under control. Now Libya and the U.S. are starting to pump oil and gas again, and the price is going all over the place. So some comments about, so we have economic disruption, we have society and societal disruption. Well, these protests are worldwide. Here's a 2-page spread from the New York Times the other day about protests, mainly Antifa and Black Lives Matters, about the killing in Minneapolis of George Floyd. Protest everywhere you look. And now here comes the next thing, as if we needed a next thing. Calls to defund the police. Now, when somebody says defund the police, that sort of raises an expectation in mind that they want to defund the police. And there was a unanimous resolution adopted in Minneapolis talking about dismantling the thing. Here's the, be it further resolved, this is just one phrase out of a several-page document, adopted by all members of the Minneapolis City Council, which includes some people like Jeremiah Ellison, son of Keith Ellison, who is a Muslim Brotherhood care guy, who's himself the Attorney General of Minnesota. Be it further resolved that the City Council will engage with every willing community member in Minneapolis, centering the voices of Black people, American Indian people, people of color, immigrants, victims of harm, and other stakeholders who have been historically marginalized or underserved by our present system. Together we will identify what safety looks like for everyone. And here is Lisa Bender, interviewed on CNN about this resolution, and here's what she had to say.
Our police department is not keeping every member of our community safe. And so I think step one for us is to tell the truth. 9 council members from communities all across the city of all different backgrounds standing together to tell the truth and say, this system isn't working for too many of our neighbors for too long. our reform efforts have failed, and we have done many attempts at reform and new leadership in the department and many things, and we still see this tragic death. And so I think the wake up of our community is what's driving the city council's announcement yesterday, and now the hard work begins for us to rebuild systems that really work to keep all of our communities safe.
But to be clear, you're not talking about reform. The word dismantle is intentionally different than reform. This is more than reform. This is dismantling. I mean, activists who support this are calling this a police-free future.
Yeah, and a lot of us were asked if we could imagine a future without police back in 2017 when we were running for office. And I answered yes to that question. To me, that future is a long way away, and it would take an enormous amount of investment.
Do you understand that the word dismantle or police-free also makes some people nervous? For instance, what if in the middle of the night my home is broken into? Who do I call?
Yes, I mean, I hear that loud and clear from a lot of my neighbors. And I know, and myself too, and I know that comes from a place of privilege, because for those of us for whom the system is working, I think we need to step back and imagine what it would feel like to already live in that reality, where calling the police may mean more harm is done. And so in the very immediate, we have to lean into whatever changes we can make in our existing police department.
I'm keeping my head from exploding. It's right here where I want to cue up what I think is probably the most insipid, silly, stupid, and dangerous song ever written by a man, and that's that piece of garbage, Imagine, by John Lennon. This is what's driving her policy. She wants to create this utopia. So on 16th Street, leading up to the White House, we now have Black Lives Matter. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of what they actually say, because they're very popular. And everybody is kowtowing to Black Lives Matter now. So I think we should actually look at their documents and see what they say. So here it is, what we believe. 4 years ago, what is known as Black Lives Matter Global Network began to organize. It started out as a chapter-based member-led organization whose mission was to build local power and to intervene when violence was inflicted on black communities by the state and vigilantes. In the years since, we've committed to struggling together and to imagining and creating a world free of, here's the imagining again, right? And you'll see, this is all Marxism, neo-Marxism stuff. You'll see collective action, imagining, building. And what did Lisa Bender want, the city councilwoman from Minneapolis? If I can say city councilwoman anymore. I don't even know if I'm allowed to say that anymore without getting canceled. Anyway, they want to create this utopia. In the years since, we've committed to struggling together and to imagining and creating a world free of anti-blackness, where every black person has the social, economic, and political power to thrive. So this is, we are guided by the fact that all Black lives matter regardless of actual, and now here's what they're going to do is they're going to drag in every victim category that they can, regardless of actual or perceived sexual identity, gender expression, economic status, ability, disability, religious beliefs or disbeliefs, immigration status or location. We are guided by the fact that all Black lives matter regardless of the actual or perceived sexual identity, gender expression, economic status, ability, disability, religious beliefs or disbeliefs, immigration status, or location. We make space for transgender brothers and sisters to participate and lead. We are self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege. In case you don't know what cisgender privilege is, I'm a male. I believe in a male-female distinction, so I'm exercising cisgender privilege. Actually, I asked somebody this week about white privilege. not to brag, but was I exercising white privilege when I crawled out of bed every morning for years in a row, and the latest I got into the office was 4:45 a.m. and I worked 10 to 20-hour days, sometimes longer. Was that privilege? This I have to tell you, this is an incipient evil that's being pushed on the world. It's full of lies. It is destroying culture in the world. It's satanic. Somebody said you can be a Christian or you can be a Marxist, but you cannot be both. So we disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. Do you see what they're trying to do? They are trying to destroy every single thing that Christianity stands for. This is direct quotes from Black Lives Matter website. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. That comes from the Hebrew Bible, folks. That's not Western. Right? Is Middle Eastern now Western? They don't even know history. Romans 1 in operation. God has, as I've said, God has more on the world. It's very frustrating to read all this nonsense. By supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. We foster a queer-affirming network when we gather. We do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual unless she, he, or they disclose otherwise. If you don't think this is all connected, I don't have time to put everything on the slide, and I would love to do this to show you. But there's an organization called Advocates for Children, I think it's called. And what it is, it's really related to Planned Parenthood. It's the sexual education side of them, and they talk about how we're going to bust up all these things about, we're going to make it so people don't feel awkward talking about sexual matters in public. They're breaking down all the moral values. There's a reason why it's supposed to feel awkward. It's sort of the way God designed it. Not sort of. It is the way God designed it. I am spitting all over my computer today. More than usual. I mean, usually it's not visible until I get home, but now no, don't give me need to cover this up. Maybe too late. So, may need to send it to Apple. And I can see what did you do to this? Did you drop it in a tub? No, just had it open when I was talking. So this Advocates for Children, Planned Parenthood, they're pushing their agenda everywhere. So I just did a little research. I saw it on a Facebook post this morning, so I looked into it. Guess who they're funded by? Guess who one of their big contributors is? Open Society Foundation, George Soros. So here's so they took over part of Seattle. They set up the Capitol Hill. It's called Chaz. And here's a little video that shows you some of the stuff going on in Chaz. No cops, street closed. And there's bad language there. Get used to it. You're now entering the free Cap Hill zone. And you see what they did in their Seattle People's Department, East Precinct. We don't need police. We protect us. Abolish Seattle Police Department. The number one need of free people is to define their own terms. Well, at least they're honest. And you'll see here some more. This is what it looks like on the street. They've set up barricades. I guess border walls are okay now. I have trouble keeping up with what's politically correct, you know. I admit I'm a dinosaur. And the Antifa people, they're all on the mask thing because they wear them all the time anyway. A guy was being arrested in Atlanta. He stole a taser from the cop, pointed it at the cop. He was shot and killed. The two cops involved have now been fired. The police chief of Atlanta has resigned. A female, I believe she's female. You can never make any assumptions these days. And a Wendy's, where it happened, has been burned to the ground. Privately owned business. It's really kind of shocking what we're seeing. And so here is this now. This is they sort of appended this to the end of the Black Lives Matter on 16th Street leading up to the White House, now the Defund the Police. And you'll see these articles. There's an article in the Washington Post by a law professor from Georgetown Law School, very well-respected law school, and she says this, here's what it really means, because, you know, we're the people, we get to define the terms, right? So you might think you have this in your mind what defunding is, but you don't really know what defunding is because we're going to tell you what defunding is. So she says this, defunding and abolition probably means something different from what you are thinking. Well, that's a true statement. For most proponents, defunding the police does not mean zeroing out budgets for public safety, and police abolition does not mean that the police will disappear overnight or perhaps ever. Defunding the police means shrinking the scope of police responsibilities and shifting most of what government does to entities that are better equipped to meet that need. It means investing more in mental health care and housing and expanding the use of community mediation and violence interruption programs. Now, I have a master's degree in criminology, and some of this language was working its way into criminology programs back in those days through Marxism, a book by a guy named Richard or Robert Quinney, Critique of Legal Order. I read it. It was one of my class assignments. I told the professor, I was a graduate assistant, I shared an office with his graduate assistants, and I told him, Bob, I said, look, I read this because I wanted to get an A, but don't make me read this garbage anymore. You know it's nonsense. And he went on to head up a major sociology department at a major university. So anyway, then the New York Times this morning is, yes, we mean literally abolish the police. So they'll say, well, we don't really mean getting rid of the police. But every now and then, one of them gets through the firewall that they've set up to protect us from this. And so note the title. It says, abolish the police. And she talks about, can we reform it? And she says this in her article. I can't remember what she does. Enough. We can't reform the police. The only way to diminish violence is to reduce contact between the public and the police. There is not a single era in United States history in which the police were not a force of violence against black people. And when you look at the, by the way, if you go back to Chaz, In Chaz, by the way, there was a list, and again, I didn't have time to put it on a slide, that said things we need in Chaz. And the first item was male briefs. And I'm like, you sexist, cisgender, privileged Marxist demanding male clothing. I mean, can't you see beyond sex and gender, for crying out loud? If I'll use a phrase Dennis Prager uses every day. If stupidity were water, the world would drown. In Britain, you've seen them knocking over statues. This morning, for a time, when you put British prime ministers in a Google search, Churchill was missing. They put a box around one of Churchill's statues, and they said, we're probably going to have to move any of his statues to a museum. And they're knocking over this statue and that statue. And this brings to mind the phrase that they used to use about the old Soviet Union, that if you think the future's uncertain, the past is always changing around here. They're rewriting history. This is like Orwell. Not like Orwell, it is Orwellian. It's exactly what, he just got the year wrong. He missed by 36 years. Because that's what's happening. So this is happening. And here's a guy who wrote in the Independent. Now, there's a big controversy about J.K. Rowling. Now, I think J.K. Rowling, besides being probably the richest author of all time, she's a billionaire, multi-billionaire, with the Harry Potter series. I think opening people to the occult is a very dangerous thing. But she has been studying the transgender thing, and she's expressed, like, if you go too far in the transgender thing, you really diminish women, the role of actually real women. And she's being just savage. And of course, there's an article there in the Independent the other day by Amr al-Qadi, how Britain's colonial past can be traced through to the transphobic feminism of today. Here's a little closer shot of the person who wrote this. By the way, I use screenshots like this because I think I have this fear that if I didn't do that, I would be accused of making it up. And I'm not making it up, unfortunately. I notice he gave me layers of towels here so I can remove when... John Podhoretz has an article in the New York Post the other day, a moral madness. He refers to a soundbite that somebody made. He says, Procaccino's soundbite immortalized one of the most enraging figures in modern U.S. society. The preachy, self-righteous, anti-capitalist, but conveniently rich and socially prominent person who decries American injustice and gives lip service to the need for radical change without ever having to fear the consequences of the often violent forces he supports. It's sort of like when the COVID thing, when people were quarantining. I was like, I'm with you all on my 90-foot yacht. I'm suffering with you all. Podhoretz says, half a century later, in the midst of America's latest urban upheaval, we find a new American type, more interesting perhaps than the limousine liberal, because she doesn't really have doormen or private cops to protect her from the threat to civil order she welcomes. We might call her the Prius wokester. I drive a Prius, by the way. But I'm not woke in the sense of this. He goes on to say this. He references an article in the Chicago Tribune. I think I have the article correct here. He references, I'll just quote what he says. He's talking about somebody who's made these quotes. I think he's referencing a New York Times post. Jaffe details how the aftermath of the killing and the developments of the streets of their city led them to embrace the looting and destruction around them. Yeah, he's talking about, they did a piece, I think it was in the Washington Post, on two ladies in a suburb of, in a like little bungalow streets full of bungalows in a very nice neighborhood in St. Paul. And these two white liberal Prius wokesters were talking to each other, and they said, well, they got the Walgreens. Well, it's okay. I mean, they got the Walgreens. What's the big deal about Walgreens? And the Target's boarded up. But, it's okay. And he's like, what is wrong with people? Do they not understand what's going on? And he says this, Pot Horse, that's a pretty standard issue. Left liberal 30-something mom should so easily make the shift from indignation about police brutality to outright support for brazen violent criminality and robbery doesn't seem an exception in these weeks. Something horrifying is happening to the American moral sense. The plain evidence of one's own eyes in the form of wanton destruction is overlooked in favor of offering some kind of generalized support for the cause. And then this article by John Cass in the Chicago Tribune. And he references, I apologize, I didn't get the front page of the Chicago Sun-Times the other day. May 31st, Sunday, May 31st, was a day like no day we've ever seen in Chicago. 18 people murdered on the streets, one Sunday. I believe all of them were black. Have you heard any protests about that? What is wrong? The fact that this is ignored is satanic in its origin and its core. And so he titles his commentary on this, "This isn't an Orwellian tale. This is your country." And of course, it's accompanied by, what do you see? People taking a knee. There's a blog post, a podcast and a blog post that you should read. Secure Freedom Radio, Frank Gaffney, has done several great interviews. Just Google Secure Freedom Radio. First one is Stephen Coughlin, Coughlin. He interviewed them all for an hour. He then interviewed Jeff Nyquist. Jeff wrote an editorial on his blog. Just look up Jeffrey Nyquist, Nyquist. And it's what I want to say to Americans who are taking the knee. And he said, I'll paraphrase, we're in really, really big trouble. And I think John Cass brings this to the post. And then there's also a podcast where Frank interviews Trevor Loudon. The Enemies Within is his work. The Red-Green Axis. I think you should listen to all those. They're about 43 minutes each. Secure Freedom Radio. But listen to a little bit of what John Cass says. What you're really seeing is Americans kneel, hands raised in secular prayer, repeating of political creeds on the TV news, and that secular foot washing. You're witness to neo-Marxist appropriation of Christian symbolism in the aftermath of the horrifying Minneapolis police killing of George Floyd. And now the priests of the secularist left separate the biblical sheep from the goats on the basis of skin color. Yet many who seek reform are themselves confused and fearful. In the biblical parable of the sheep and the goats, the sheep went to heaven, the goats were sent to hell. But in the current political universe, whites must atone for the sins of white racism, even if they are not racist, even if their families arrived here only yesterday, and even the mere suggestion that this might be unfair, the slightest hint of resistance can trigger accusations that could ruin careers, deny interest to the professions, drive nuance from the public square, and it is all by design. And this is true. There's a professor in UCLA. He was asked, white students wrote to him and said, look, we have an exam coming up. Could you kind of grade easy on this exam because our black friends are upset about what's happening and that type of thing. And the professor said, how do I do this? I don't know who's black and white. And then they said, well, why don't you just not grade this exam? And he said, that's the only exam in the class. It's the only way I have to grade you. And he goes, and so you're black, but you have a white mother and a black father. Do you only get half courtesy? He's been terminated by UCLA for being logical. A person who does strategic planning for the Chicago Federal Reserve, I believe is a professor at the University of Chicago. He's been terminated because he questioned the wisdom of this. There is a church, the church at the Highlands in Birmingham. This church runs 40 to 50,000 people every week. They meet in 22 locations. A number of them, they rent high schools, which a lot of churches do, rent school buildings. And so what somebody did, a fascist teacher from one of the schools where this church rents and meets, went back and looked at the pastor's social media history and found out that he had liked tweets by Charlie Kirk, a conservative and a bit of a firebrand, conservative Turning Point. I'm sure you've heard of him. And because this pastor had liked his tweets, the city of Birmingham school says you could not meet in our schools anymore. They do COVID free, they do free COVID testing for people. They have like a health clinic. They do meals, they do, housing and that type of thing. And the Birmingham Housing Authority says, we don't want anything to do with you either. The head of CrossFit, the founder of CrossFit, made just a little comment about this, and he's resigned. Founded a billion-dollar company. He's out. You're only at the beginning of a very, very dark satanic wave. So let's go back to the Cass article because I think this is important. Oops. Here we go. Christianity teaches that all of us are sinners, that repentance comes before forgiveness. But today's hard left, and I would just say today's left, is not about forgiveness, it is about power. The new use of religious symbolism in politics isn't new. I've seen 2 recent presidents absurdly wave the Bible to ward off the demons of negative news, Clinton and Donald Trump. He says, call it exploitation. But neo-Marxists hostile to faith, appropriating religious practice and using the race to separate sheep from goat in the service of power on earth are a profoundly different matter. Politics is their religion. It is relentlessly Orwellian. This isn't some dystopian novel. This is your country. History informs us that liberty and democracy aren't the natural state of humankind. A democratic republic is difficult enough to maintain even in cultures with a history of ideals vital for nourishing a democracy. Now, though, Americans are being encouraged to decolonize our home libraries. So which books do I rid myself of first? Aristotle, Edmund Burke, The Road to Serfdom, or the Bible? Coerced, fearful kneeling in fealty isn't among democracy's necessary virtues. Even American pop culture, even comic books once recognized this. But that must have been some other country, one that looked remarkably like this one. I kept thinking of that, is it the second Superman movie with Christopher Reeves? Kneel Before Zog. Remember that? Sure saw a lot of that. Christianity Today came out with an article by the editor, Timothy Dalrymple, Justice Too Long Delayed. It's time for the church to make restitution for racial sin. Pay reparations. I think that if you have paper copies of Christianity Today, they make good kindling or fire starters. So look, this is the world. it's maddening. It's frustrating. It is dire. So if you think last week was dark, I don't know, get used to it. Listen, I'm not without hope. I know Jesus is coming back and cleaning this whole mess up. And more than ever, I look forward to that. Because our methods, I just don't think are going to work. So let's talk a little bit about the Middle East and a few things that are going on there in the time we have remaining. So there's a big deal going on right now that there's a big controversy. Netanyahu has said that he's going to annex certain parts of the territories. Now, and so there are fights. So Jeremy Gimpel and Ari Abramowitz, they have the Land of Israel Network. They're both Jewish rabbis. I've met and talked to Jeremy some. And so it's funny because in Jewish life, and you see this when you're walking around Jerusalem. This is stereotyping people, I guess. But it seems like everybody's arguing and mad at everybody else. And so I was listening to their podcast the other morning, and they were talking about annexation. And Ari thinks, don't worry about annexation. It's our land anyway. Forget about annexation. And you can make a good argument for that. Dor Gold has a pretty good video up at Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs where he talks about this. Look, San Remo gave us this land. Why are we even talking about annexation? And Jeremy says, no, Ari, we got to be careful. We got to do it the right way. We got to do these. And so they're fighting and everything, and then they go have dinner with each other. It's sort of like the life of a law, being a life of a lawyer. You argue about things, you fight, you argue, you stomp, and then you go have lunch. You don't take it personal, but so there's this big controversy now. Should they annex? Should they not annex? And the Palestinians say, we're going to collapse the Palestinian Authority. If you try to annex or if you do the annex, Jordan, Egypt, everybody's getting involved and saying, you can't do this. This will disrupt the Middle East peace process to the extent that there is a peace process. Some of the settlers are upset. You can't do this. We remember what happened in Gaza in 2005 when you closed down and made us evacuate 18 communities. We got to protect against that. That was terrible. That was horrible. That was Israel terrorizing its own people. And it didn't prove, well, look what happened to Gaza. You took us out of Gaza and Gaza went really bad. So there's been this belief, I think, this hope that, well, look, Israel's making inroads with the Arabs. They're sort of getting on our side. And in a kind of I think a pretty important editorial that ran in Ynet News. In Ynet News, the United Arab Emirates ambassador warned the Israeli people that if you annex, everything's going to fall apart, and you do not want to do that. Here's a little video that he put up about his editorial.
We wanted to speak directly to the Israelis. The message was, all the progress that you've seen and the attitudes that have been changing towards Israel, people becoming more accepting of Israel and less hostile to Israel, all of that could be undermined by a decision to annex. All the progress that you've seen and exchanges and openings could be undermined by one simple step. I wanted to make sure people understood how we saw this possibility and the risks associated with it. There's opportunity for sure that has potential in the coming years as attitudes shift towards Israel, but this could be a setback for all of these things, and especially for the Israelis who are so keen on opening relationships with new Arab countries that they don't currently have relationships with. So I wanted to make sure people understood the risks associated with decision beyond the immediate consequences of what happens on the Israeli-Palestinian. This land is disputed land. This is supposed to be part of a negotiation. This is supposed to be part of a two-state solution. And by moving unilaterally, you're basically saying, I don't believe in the negotiation or the two-state solution, or I'm doing something to undermine it. So those are two different sectors for me. The American government could do whatever they want with their embassy, but this land is subject to an ongoing dispute for the past 60 years, and you're essentially trying to resolve the dispute without a negotiation. I think there is going to be tremendous amount of pressure on countries like Jordan, who have demographic challenges and economic challenges. This will make their challenges even more difficult. And as we said in the op-ed, Jordan's stability is something that is instrumental to the region, instrumental to Israel, and many of us take for granted, to be honest. And I thought it was really important to make sure people understand how that decision on annexation will affect countries like Jordan, Egypt, and
it's true. The annexation, he warned, will spark violence and arouse extremism. It will send tidal waves across the region. Seth Frantzman has a good article today about why this is a pretty important thing that happened, why it's unprecedented that the United Arab Emirates would give a warning like this. So in the context of all of this, people meeting about sovereignty and annexation and that type of thing, there is a significant pushback from what most people would consider a moderate Arab country. This is one of the foreign ministers she works in the foreign ministry of the United Arab Emirates. She tweeted out the Hebrew tweet, a tweet in Hebrew about the article that appeared. It said here, in the UAE, this is the translation, in the UAE and in much of the Arab world, we would like to believe that Israel is an opportunity, not an enemy. We face too many shared dangers and see huge potential for hotter connections. Israel's decision to annex would be an unmistakable sign, whether it sees things the same way. Turkey is also weighing in. They're saying, listen, if you annex, we're gonna have to take action against you, Israel. So do you see things being sort of set up and pushed towards this, towards some of the inevitable wars? Elsewhere, we have these wars going on. This one's a little bit, remember this border standoff, because this is important, because China and India are kind of mixing it up in the Himalayas, and there's a reason for that, and I'll talk about that at the end as we go forward. Seth Frantzman from Jerusalem Post also has some tweets and articles about the use of drones in these wars in the Middle East now, and how that technology is changing anything. This morning they found that Yemen has a major drone production operation going on. This changes things. Seth has an article, Russian air defense systems outmatched by Turkish drones in Syria and Libya. And of course, we see this conflict that's been going on between Russia and Turkey in Syria, really between Turkey and Syria, but Russia is backing Syria. And so they're using drones. Everything is very complicated. Everything is sort of at a razor edge. This is what Seth says: a second round of Turkish drones versus Russian air defense played out in Libya in the first weeks of May, culminating in the capture of the Watia air base by government of the National Accord Forces in May 17th. So that's what's going on in Syria. Can I back up for just a second, because I wanted to make a point about this. This is a deli in Chicago, on the near west side of Chicago. It was voted and considered to be the most popular, most loved restaurant in Chicago. Nini's Deli. Google what it looks like today. Because the owner said, I support some of what Black Lives Matter says, but when they bring in all of this abortion and transgender stuff, I can't support them. The restaurant is now permanently closed. It's been open for decades. Cancel culture. Here's that thing. This is what's going on. This is what you should be concerned about. There's actually a magazine called Jacobin Magazine. Now, I don't know if you know about the Jacobins, but they were a group that came out of the French Revolution. And what they did was they sort of became the thought police. If you're not with us, you're against us. And they took it a step further. If you're not with us, you're against us, and we will behead you. And hundreds of thousands of people in France, under the guise of liberty and freedom and equality, were beheaded because they didn't go with the program, and a lot of them were Christians. And you see these people using Jacobin language, and a lot of the things they said is because they just want to build a better, more equal, fairer society, right? A utopia. But if you don't go along with it, they're going to do what Mao did. They're going to do what Stalin did. And that's why giving these people even an inch of a city is a big problem. I'm trying to remember what I heard somebody talk about. Seattle, gone. Minneapolis, gone. Washington, gone. New York, gone. I don't know if they come back. I was even talking to some people here locally yesterday. So they drove down High Street, downtown around the State House and up into the short north. And it's like, I don't even know if anything's open because everything's boarded up. All the windows are broken out. And that's repeated in city after city after city, all over the place. The EU stepped into this situation with the annexation in Israel and said, look, guys, we'll punish you if you annex anything. This has to be negotiated. So we see all of this set up for this confirmation of the covenant and that sort of thing that we talk about in Bible prophecy, because I've never seen a situation where more people are sort of, everything is a very tense nature. Everything is very tense. Everybody's fighting with each other. And I think someone could step into this, or someone step into this with we have a plan for safety. You remember Lisa Bender when she was interviewed about the defunding the police, dismantling the police in Minneapolis? She said, we want safety. We want safety. And I would add, we'll kill you for safety. And so this is the world that the Bible prophesied, and I think this is the world that we live in. Jonathan Spire has a very good article in the Jerusalem Post about Syria. And what you're seeing right now is you're seeing these conflicts develop in Syria and Libya that I think are playing into Bible prophecy, because all the major players of Bible prophecy are present in Syria, and even more so in Libya now, where the proxy wars are going on at a greater level. So Jonathan Spire says, listen, I don't know if Assad will survive. It's going to be very difficult for him. You might take a look at that. You might also go back to, I'll just play a couple minutes of it, an interview with Jennifer Carafella from the Institute for the Study of War, talking about Syria at the INSS conference a few months ago.
I'd like to start by framing a bit of how I see Syria's trajectory for the next 10 years, because it will inform the comments I'm going to make about the U.S. role I would like to see us to play, as well as the role I think we're more likely to play, given where this current administration is headed. There are three key factors. So I actually don't share the assessment that Syria is headed into some kind of post-war phase. I don't think that Bashar has won the war. And unfortunately, I think that 10 years from now, it's always difficult to predict, but I think 10 years from now, Syria is actually likely to remain a war zone, given many of the underlying conditions that are still present. And there are three key factors or drivers that I think are important to keep in mind as we consider the trajectory of this theater. The first is the deep and enduring fragility of the Assad regime. Assad, as was mentioned, I think, by General Votel in his statements, cannot secure terrain that he recaptured as recently as 2018. As General Votel mentioned, the attack campaign against the regime and its backers in Dara province alone has returned to 2011 levels. We share that assessment, and we've been watching very closely how that insurgency is gaining traction. Slowly, it's not making too many headlines, but it is gaining traction and freedom of movement. What does that tell you? It means that Assad's gains are much more impressive on a map than they are in reality. Comments have already been made that I definitely agree with in terms of the structure of the regime's military forces and the challenges that Assad has in consolidating. But the reason I point to the regime's fragility as a driver of future conflict is in part because it's going to get a lot worse for the regime in the next coming years.
So you can go back, I covered that a few months ago in one of my updates. You can also find that video on YouTube. Panel with Jonathan Spire, Jennifer Carafella, and a couple others talking about the situation in Syria. Now here comes someone from one of the world organizations saying famine is knocking on Syria's door. And as I'm looking around, and I get reports from people all over the place, Vietnam rice crop is down. You may have noticed it's kind of cold here in Ohio right now. I don't know what impact, and it's been pretty wet. I don't know what impact that's going to have on our crops. Vietnam is importing rice and grain because they don't have enough. Their crops are bad because there was a drought, and China's shutting off rivers, and they don't have the water. And so there's like, I feel like I'm piling on the direness of everything that's happening, and I just see there's a lot of problems. This is a good article that was referenced in some of the Jonathan Spire's Syria. Will the great Middle Eastern war begin in the Levant? Listen to the opening statement that is made in this article. The world is in turmoil. Is it? Yeah. 2020 has already brought multiple major crises, from the Iranian-American clash in Iraq, which followed the U.S. assassination of Major General Qasem Soleimani, and the COVID-19 health pandemic, and an economic disaster that struck all the continents and stole the lives of over 400,000 people around the world, costing tens of millions of jobs. This was written a few weeks ago. In the Middle East, other fronts are taking the shape in the shadows to prevent war or to trigger a wider military confrontation. A likely front is the Levant, where preparations are being made to confront Israel and in its continued violations of Syria's sovereignty and a bombardment of hundreds of targets in Syria throughout the years of the war. This particular issue may bring the Middle East into an all-out war. One mistake could turn fatal and drag the region into an all-out clash in which Syria will not be alone. And in it, he goes on to say that Israel, right now, with what's going on in Syria, is walking a strategic minefield. They have to be very careful. They've been taking out Iranian targets. So what have the Iranians done in response to that? They are mixing it up with the Syrian forces. They're actually wearing Syrian army uniforms. Their command and control structure is being embedded within the Syrian military, which means that if Israel strikes, it's likely to take out Syrians and create a war, or it's likely to take out Hezbollah people and create a war. And this article goes on to say that, look, Hezbollah has gotten a lot of training. They've become very good fighters through the years of their being used by Assad in the Syrian civil war. And all of this plays into Bible prophecy. There are Iranian army and military people being seen in areas around the Golan Heights. Now, I don't think it's at the stage where we're at Ezekiel 38 or 39 yet. I'm just telling you that the foundation for that is being built. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I would not say that it's imminent by any stretch of the imagination. Here's what this article says. Israel is walking through a strategic minefield. The danger for Israel lies in any potential error that might kill Hezbollah members in Syria. Such an outcome would lead to an escalation that may take the Middle East region into a larger and more comprehensive war. Nevertheless, wars can start by mistake. Will Israel make such a fatal mistake? So we have the problems in Syria. We also have a problem where Lebanon, where Hezbollah is based and really runs the government, is melting down. Riots, protests, the banking system, everything is a mess there. Libya, this is kind of interesting because Libya is a player in the Ezekiel 38, 39 scenario. But right now they're in the midst of a civil war. There's a very good article in this morning's edition of the Gatestone Institute, Powers, play with fire in Libya. And they make a couple of observations about Turkey is supporting the Libyan national government. The rebel group under Haftar is being supported by Russia. So here you have, Syria, Turkey and Russia kind of getting into it in Syria. You have Turkey and Russia at odds in Libya. And what Turkey is doing is they're taking Syrian rebels and importing them to Libya to do the fighting. And they've actually made some pretty good gains over the past couple of weeks. But listen to this. This is kind of an interesting thing as to how could an alliance of Turkey, Russia, Iran ever emerge out of what's this fighting going on in Syria, this conflict that's going on in Libya. Listen to this. According to Moscow sources, Russian President Vladimir Putin hopes to gain a pause and resupply base for his navy on Libya's 1,770-kilometer-long Mediterranean coast to complement the aero-naval bases that he's obtained in Syria. Reluctant to get involved with boots on the ground, Putin has been generous with military supplies. More importantly, perhaps he has given the green light to 4 Russian private security firms to send military trainers, advisors, technicians, and even combat troops to Libya. So there is this conflict, and so Libya has the longest coastline on the Mediterranean of any country. People want that. Russia would like to have a base there, but the guy they're supporting in the eastern part of Libya is not doing too well. The Turkish-backed forces in the western part of Libya are sort of taking back control of the country. And so the question is any of this going to resolve quickly? And if so, how does it resolve? There were scheduled today, but they put them off, but there were talks that were scheduled. There were talks that were scheduled in between, not in Turkey or Russia, but between Turkish and Russian foreign ministers. And part of the talk was, listen, let's reach an agreement. Turkey, you back off in Syria. We'll back off in Libya, maybe if we get our port and our base. And so what you see then is you see a further sort of increase in the alignment that you would see in Ezekiel 38 and 39. But I still don't think it's at that stage where I would term it imminent. Oh. And so let me finish with this. 2 things. There's a water war going on in Turkey, or I'm sorry, between Egypt and Ethiopia over the Nile River. Ethiopia is damming up. They have a thing called the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, and it's giving acid reflux to Egypt. And so they're on the verge of war. Egypt sent tanks over to Libya today to help the Russian-backed rebels. And then there's this. China. The end of Hong Kong. This is the cover of the current Newsweek magazine. And the Hong Kong, they've taken over. They had agreements that Hong Kong would be like it was until 2042, and China's essentially torn that agreement up and said we're going to do whatever we want in Hong Kong. And this is kind of an interesting thing here. He's eating the lotus flower. There's the flag there, and then there's this thing underneath the next thing that China's going to consume. And I saw a report this week from a guy who does a thing called the Caspian Report, and he talked about China and Tibet. And this sort of relates to the Vietnam thing that I was talking about. The major water systems of Asia and India come from Tibetan glaciers in the Himalayas. And what China has done is gone in there and dammed up the rivers for hydroelectric power and water. So, for example, with regard to the Mekong Delta, that is vital to the survival of Cambodia and Vietnam, they've dammed up the rivers enough that are going down that way that the water flow, it's sort of like the Colorado River in the United States. It used to go all the way to the Gulf or to the Sea of Cortez. Now it stops someplace in the desert of California or Arizona because everybody's siphoned off all the water. Vegas, Phoenix, all the cities there. There's just in Southern California. And so this is what's happening. So China's controlling this whole area now through water. So I think it's something you need to pay attention to because it could lead to major conflicts in Southeast Asia as China moves in. I'm only pointing this out because this is yet another area of wars and rumors of wars. And let's finish with this. So the World Economic Forum, if you want to know what the globalists are doing, now I don't know how successful the globalists will be in Bible prophecy. I think they will try to take over the world. I think there will be efforts made, but there's going to be resistance to what they do. But they're going to try. And so through the World Economic Forum, which has been around for 50 years now, they're sort of telegraphing or putting out there what their plans are. And this week they released this thing. So remember, they have this website, Strategic Intelligence. I've shown you pictures of it before. I would encourage you to go and look around there a little bit. And they have a section for COVID-19 that sort of came up and is populated with all these videos and articles and research and all this almost immediately. And this week they added a new site for a new section of that Strategic Intelligence site for their conference coming up in early 2021, which is going to be called the Great Reset. So here's the Great Reset. Here's just, look at this little video that's sort of on the website that shows what they're sort of talking about. Kind of interesting because if I covered that in Bible in a prophecy update, everybody would say, "Oh, John, you're just you're being an extremist, right?" I'm only taking what they did. So these are our guest prophecy updaters this week. I've had all these other people come, and so they're talking about the Great Reset, and in the context of that, there was this. So here's part of the Great Reset website from Strategic Intelligence. All the different things, restoring the health of the environment, redesigning social contracts, skills, and jobs. So, redesigning, redeveloping collective action. And it comes in the context of this. You should look it up. This Archbishop Vigano wrote this letter to President Trump. Have you seen this thing? Where he talks about, here's just a little bit of what he says in this. Now, listen, you know my feelings about Roman Catholicism, but this is what he said. Mr. President, in recent months, we have been witnessing the formation of two opposing sides that I would call biblical. the children of light and the children of darkness. The children of light constitute the most conspicuous part of humanity, and I would disagree with that, while the children of darkness represent an absolute minority. I do not agree with that. In society, though, he says, Mr. President, these two opposing realities coexist as eternal enemies, just as God and Satan are eternal enemies. And it appears that the children of darkness, whom we may easily identify with the deep state, which you wisely oppose and which is fiercely waging war against you these days, have decided to show their cards, so to speak. Show their cards? We got whole websites devoted to it now. I mean, it's all laid out there right there in the open. So I encourage you to read this. The Jesuit magazine, American Magazine, said this: Archbishop Vigano is aligning with Trump to stay in the spotlight. Pay him no attention. And so I will close with this. This is Mr. Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, who just celebrated their 50th anniversary this year. And he's talking about the Great Reset. And this is showing their cards on steroids. Listen to what he says.
To hundreds of millions of people around the world. The COVID-19 crisis has shown us that our old systems are not fit anymore for the 21st century. It has laid bare the fundamental lack of social cohesion, fairness, inclusion, and equality. Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight the severe virus, but to shape the system for the need for the post-corona era. We have a choice to remain passive, which would lead to the amplification of many of the trends we see today: polarization, nationalism, racism, and ultimately increased social unrest and conflicts. But we have another choice. We can build a new social contract, particularly integrating the next generation. We can change our behavior to be in harmony with nature again. And we can make sure that the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution are best utilized to provide us with better lives. In short, we need a great reset.
So there's our guest updater. This is Anthony Gutierrez. He also has something on the Great Reset website. A number of other people spoke, including, interestingly enough, Prince Charles. My reaction when I see Prince Charles is long live the Queen. And I also want to say, just from a technical side, is for crying out loud, your family's worth billions of dollars. Go buy a better camera and lighting, for crying out loud, okay? And he prattles on about, how this is going to be great. We're all going to come together. And this is very significant what's going on that we see. They are saying exactly what they want to do. And they all seem to be working in concert. And it's interesting, whenever one of these crises comes up now, the World Economic Forum is, hey, look, we got everything here on our website. Just go look. COVID-19, now racial inequality, social unrest. We'll do the Great Reset. They ratchet it up every time. I do think we live in the end times. We have great promises as to what will happen to us. And we need to focus on that. We need to focus on getting the gospel out to people, because it does seem like time is getting shorter and shorter. I know Pam and I, sometimes we sit around and talk, and it's like, it's Thursday, right? It's Monday afternoon. Oh, seemed like enough stuff happened that it should be Thursday. And so time is both slowing down and speeding up, and I think that's a characteristic of the end time. So listen, rejoice. When Jesus was talking to disciples about his first coming, he said, people long to see this day. Well, it's troubling time, but don't we really want Jesus to come back? We do. So we have to just kind of bear down and trust in God to get us through this. Works out really, really great in the end. So let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word, the promises and the hope that we have because we're believers in Jesus Christ. Help us to take that hope to a world that desperately needs it and shows us that it needs it every single day, every hour of every day, every minute of every hour of every day. Give us the opportunities to share the hope that we have with them. In Jesus' name, amen.